peaceful protests calling for more transparency in the Nolan Wells investigation was held Saturday evening in Mississippi. The parents are seeking answers about what led to the death of their son. Wells' body was found after a 4th of July boat trip with friends to Horn Island in Mississippi. The death has sparked speculation after his friends returned from the trip without him. Patrick Wright reports.
I feel like today's testament is that we want answers. It's not about vengeance. It's not about accusations. It's about the truth, and it's about transparency.
We're going to stand behind the family, and that's why we're out here.
No peace!
A lot of times, these stories go unnoticed.
Because Nolan Wells is not the only one. There has been a long historic string of young black men losing their life under very suspicious circumstances.
I am the family of Emmett Till, and my family is here in support of what's going on because this young man should not be dead.
No justice! No peace!
So I know him personally as a kid before he went off to college. It's hard in this generation to find kids that still say yes sir, no sir.
Nolan Wells!
Over the weekend, people from across the Gulf Coast gathered in Ocean Springs with a shared purpose. Some estimates placed the turnout at well over 100 people, while others suggested the crowd was considerably larger. Whatever the exact number, one thing was unmistakable. They came together to remember Nolan Wells and to ask that the investigation continue until every important question has been answered. At nearly the same time, a former Mississippi judge and attorney publicly weighed in on the case, arguing that certain investigative steps should already have been taken based on the information currently available. Before we examine those comments, it's important to establish how we're approaching them. What you're about to hear reflects the legal opinions of an experienced attorney speaking publicly from his own professional background. His analysis is not an official finding, it is not evidence released by investigators, and it does not represent the conclusions of any court or law enforcement agency. Throughout this update, we'll carefully separate confirmed facts from personal legal interpretation so that each can be understood in its proper context. We'll begin, however, with the people who gathered peacefully in Nolan's memory, because their presence explains why this case continues to draw so much public attention and why so many believe the search for answers is far from over. The days following Nolan Wells' death revealed something that often happens in cases attracting widespread public attention. The investigation itself continued behind closed doors, but outside those official channels, concern continued to grow. Family members, neighbors, classmates, church leaders, and complete strangers all found themselves asking the same basic question. They were not demanding a predetermined answer. They simply wanted to understand exactly what had happened during Nolan's final hours and whether every available piece of evidence would receive the careful examination they believed it deserved. As plans for a community gathering began taking shape, Nolan's mother, Christine, addressed the public before the event. Her message was remarkably consistent from beginning to end. She asked everyone who intended to participate to remain peaceful and respectful. She described Nolan as someone who avoided unnecessary conflict and said that responding with anger would not reflect the kind of person he had been. Rather than allowing emotions to turn into confrontation, she encouraged supporters to honor his memory through unity, patience, and dignity while investigators continued their work. When the gathering eventually took place, those requests appeared to guide the atmosphere. Families stood together holding signs carrying Nolan's name. Community members joined in prayer. Local faith leaders offered words of comfort while encouraging those present to remain focused on seeking truth instead of creating division. Several organizations also attended, including groups that marched through portions of the surrounding streets before returning to join the larger crowd. Although opinions differed regarding what investigators might ultimately discover, participants largely shared one common goal: ensuring that Nolan's case remained visible while official inquiries continued. Many of those attending explained why they believed their presence mattered. Younger residents described the importance of speaking up whenever unanswered questions surround the death of someone from their own community. They said public attention can help ensure that investigations remain thorough and transparent. Older attendees expressed similar feelings from a different perspective. Some explained that they viewed Nolan as representing any young person whose family suddenly finds themselves searching for answers. Others spoke about wanting to support Christine and the Wells family during what had become an extraordinarily painful period. Several people who personally knew Nolan also reflected on their experiences with him. Friends, former co-workers, neighbors, and longtime family acquaintances described him as respectful, hardworking, and polite. Some recalled simple conversations that now carried far greater emotional weight than they ever expected. Others remembered seeing him participate in school activities or community events over the years. Those stories were not presented as evidence regarding the investigation itself. Instead, they offered a picture of the young man many people believed they knew before headlines and public debate came to define his name. One recurring theme throughout the gathering centered on separating facts from assumptions. Multiple speakers emphasized that their desire for answers should never be confused with declaring anyone guilty before evidence justified such conclusions. They argued that supporting a careful investigation and respecting due process are not contradictory ideas. In their view, both can exist at the same time. Wanting transparency does not necessarily mean reaching conclusions before investigators finish examining every available piece of evidence. That distinction became especially significant because the investigation itself remained incomplete. Authorities had confirmed that an initial examination of Nolan's body had already taken place, but officials also explained that additional forensic work still remained. Toxicology testing and other laboratory analysis would require additional time before any final conclusions could be reached. Investigators stressed that preliminary observations should not be interpreted as the complete picture, since many important findings often depend upon specialized testing performed after the physical examination has concluded. For many observers, that waiting period created understandable uncertainty. Preliminary examinations are designed to identify obvious signs of injury or trauma, but they cannot immediately answer every possible question surrounding a death. Laboratory testing may identify substances, medical conditions, or other forensic findings that are simply impossible to determine during an initial examination alone. As a result, investigators frequently caution the public against drawing firm conclusions before every component of the forensic process has been completed and reviewed together. That uncertainty also helped explain why public discussion continued to expand instead of fading away. Every day without a final report left additional room for questions, speculation, and competing interpretations. Some people believed patience remained the most responsible approach until investigators released their findings. Others felt continued public attention was necessary to ensure the case never lost momentum. Although those perspectives sometimes differed, both reflected the same underlying reality. The investigation had not yet reached its conclusion, and many believed the most important answers were still ahead rather than behind. As the community continued waiting for additional forensic findings, legal analysis also became part of the public conversation. Attorneys, former prosecutors, and legal commentators began discussing what investigative steps are commonly taken during complex death investigations, and whether the publicly known facts suggested that further action might already be appropriate. Their observations did not represent official findings, but they offered viewers another way of understanding how experienced legal professionals interpret the investigative process while important questions remain unanswered. One of the most widely discussed voices was attorney Carlos Moore, a former municipal court judge who has frequently commented on civil rights and criminal justice issues in Mississippi. Speaking publicly through social media, Moore emphasized that his perspective came from years spent working within the legal system. He explained that he had previously reviewed warrant requests, evaluated affidavits, and considered evidence presented by investigators seeking judicial authorization for searches and arrests. That professional background formed the basis for the opinions he shared regarding Nolan's case. Moore repeatedly reminded viewers that he was not claiming to know exactly what happened to Nolan. Instead, he focused on the investigative process itself. In his view, public confidence often depends not only on the final outcome of an investigation, but also on whether each procedural step appears thorough, timely, and consistent with established investigative practices. He argued that maintaining transparency about those procedures can help preserve trust while investigators continue gathering evidence. A significant portion of Moore's commentary centered on Nolan's phone, which had already become an important topic in public discussion because of video footage and witness accounts that had circulated online. Moore argued that, if publicly reported descriptions accurately reflected the available evidence, investigators could potentially examine whether anyone retained Nolan's phone without his permission. He presented this as a separate legal question from determining the cause or manner of Nolan's death. According to Moore, even if larger questions remained unresolved, smaller issues involving possession of personal property could still warrant careful legal review depending upon the available evidence. His broader point was that criminal investigations often involve multiple layers rather than a single dramatic conclusion. Moore also discussed what he believed are common investigative practices during serious cases. He suggested that search warrants, subpoenas, digital evidence preservation, and formal interviews frequently become important tools when investigators seek to reconstruct timelines and verify witness statements. He acknowledged that the public rarely sees every investigative action as it occurs because many details remain confidential while cases are active. Even so, he believed that the known circumstances justified an especially comprehensive investigative approach. Another issue Moore addressed involved public statements made during the early stages of the investigation. He questioned whether certain descriptions of the case may have been interpreted by some members of the public as expressing greater certainty than the available evidence could support at that stage. From his perspective, investigators should communicate carefully while significant forensic testing remains incomplete, since early statements can influence public expectations long before all evidence has been examined. Moore additionally discussed several publicly reported circumstances surrounding individuals who were reportedly present during Nolan's final hours. He argued that investigators should carefully evaluate every witness account, electronic record, timeline, and available piece of physical evidence before reaching conclusions about anyone's involvement. Importantly, Moore's comments reflected his personal legal assessment rather than official determinations by law enforcement. No court had adopted those opinions, and investigators had not publicly announced conclusions matching every point he raised. That distinction remains essential throughout any developing investigation. Attorneys, former judges, and legal analysts frequently interpret publicly available information based upon their own professional experience. Those opinions can contribute meaningfully to public discussion, particularly when explaining how criminal investigations generally operate. However, legal commentary should never be mistaken for evidence itself. Investigators remain responsible for collecting admissible evidence, verifying witness statements, conducting forensic analysis, and presenting findings through the legal process rather than through public debate. Moore ultimately returned to a theme that many community members had already expressed in different words. He argued that patients should not be confused with inactivity, and that waiting for final forensic results should not prevent investigators from pursuing every lawful avenue available to them. At the same time, he emphasized that accusations require evidence, not assumptions. Until laboratory findings, witness interviews, digital evidence, and other investigative materials could be examined together, he cautioned against reaching definitive conclusions about criminal responsibility. His message reflected the complicated balance that often defines high-profile investigations, moving with urgency while remaining committed to fairness, accuracy, and the legal standards that ultimately determine whether any future charges can be supported. As public discussion continued, it became increasingly clear that two conversations were unfolding at the same time. One focused on evidence that investigators were actively collecting, while the other centered on how the investigation itself was being conducted. Those conversations occasionally overlapped, but they were not identical. Determining what happened to Nolan Wells would ultimately depend on forensic findings, witness statements, digital records, and other evidence gathered through the legal process. Evaluating the pace of the investigation, however, was a separate question that many people believed deserved attention regardless of what the final conclusions might eventually be. Throughout this period, community members continued emphasizing that their calls for transparency should not be interpreted as demands for a specific outcome. Many said they were prepared to accept whatever conclusion the evidence ultimately supported, provided they were confident that every reasonable investigative step had been taken. That distinction became one of the defining themes surrounding the case. The issue was not simply whether answers would arrive, but whether the public would have confidence in the process that produced those answers. Legal analysts echoed a similar point from a different perspective. They noted that complex investigations often take considerably longer than the public expects, especially when multiple agencies, forensic laboratories, and digital evidence specialists become involved. Toxicology reports, electronic data analysis, laboratory testing, and witness interviews frequently require weeks or even months before investigators are able to assemble a complete timeline. While that pace can feel frustrating for grieving families and concerned communities, it is often an unavoidable part of ensuring that conclusions are supported by reliable evidence rather than incomplete information. Even so, patience has limits when viewed through the eyes of those closest to the case. Every passing day without definitive answers naturally creates additional questions. Families continue reliving the same painful uncertainty. Friends revisit memories while searching for details they may have overlooked. Community members follow every official statement, hoping each update will finally explain what happened. In cases receiving widespread public attention, that emotional strain becomes part of the story itself, extending far beyond the investigation's technical details. Another important aspect of this case involves recognizing the difference between suspicion and proof. Public conversations often move much faster than criminal investigations. Social media posts, online videos, and personal opinions can spread within minutes, while investigators may spend weeks verifying a single fact before relying upon it. That difference sometimes creates the impression that authorities are moving too slowly when, in reality, they may be carefully testing information that cannot simply be accepted at face value. Responsible investigations require evidence capable of standing up in court, not merely convincing public opinion. The same principle applies to legal commentary. Experienced attorneys and former judges can offer valuable explanations about investigative procedures and legal standards, helping the public understand how cases typically progress. Their analyses may identify questions worth considering or investigative steps commonly used in similar circumstances. However, those professional opinions remain exactly that, opinions. They do not replace official findings, forensic reports, or judicial decisions reached through established legal procedures. As the investigation moved forward, several major questions remained unresolved. Final autopsy findings had not yet been publicly released. Toxicology testing remained an important component of the overall forensic examination. Investigators also continued reviewing witness accounts, electronic evidence, and the timeline surrounding Nolan's final known movements. Each of those elements represented part of a much larger picture that could only be understood after every available source of information had been examined together rather than in isolation. Looking back at everything that unfolded during those days, one point stands above nearly every other. The peaceful gathering organized in Nolan's memory demonstrated how deeply his death affected people from every generation within the community. At the same time, the legal discussions that followed illustrated why investigative transparency matters in cases attracting widespread public attention. Those two developments emerged from different places, but they reflected a similar hope that the investigation would continue with diligence, fairness, and a commitment to discovering the truth wherever the evidence ultimately leads. For now, the story remains unfinished. Public concern continues, legal experts continue offering their perspectives, and investigators continue performing the work required before definitive conclusions can responsibly be announced. Until those remaining questions are answered through verified evidence, the most responsible approach is to distinguish confirmed facts from speculation while allowing the investigative process to reach its conclusion. Whether the final findings ultimately confirm early assumptions or challenge them entirely, they will carry far greater weight than any theory formed before the evidence is complete. For Nolan's family, for the community that gathered in his memory, and for everyone following this case, that final search for truth remains the central question that has yet to be answered. As this investigation continues, we'll stay focused on verified developments, official findings, and evidence that can be confirmed. We'll continue following every significant update and share new information only after it has been responsibly reported. If you want clear, fact-based coverage without unnecessary speculation, be sure to subscribe to Court of Secrets and turn on notifications so you never miss the next update. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next case update.